Hello everyone, Bag here. So in this downtime before the big 3.0 patch, I thought it would be fun to give some advice on all of the current 5-star characters in HSR, so that you can get more use out of all of the units that you've pulled for your account. Now, some of these tips are more obvious than others, but my hope with this video is that you can learn something new that you can apply to your endgame clears. With all that being said, let's get started. When playing around Himeko's talent, the biggest thing to consider is the lack of overflow with her stacks. So trying not to waste breaks when you already have enough breaks for a follow-up is the key to maximizing the amount of follow-ups that she can launch. Also, as far as I can tell, this isn't mentioned anywhere in her actual abilities, but consider that elite enemies give an entire 3 stacks to her, so they can give an entire follow-up all by themselves. It might be worth it to try and break elite enemies with your follow-up's toughness damage, as this will then guarantee another follow-up immediately afterwards. This tip goes for a lot of sustains, but it should be in your best interest with Bailu to avoid using her skill too often, as it provides 0 offensive utility without high eidolons, and otherwise it's only a sink for skill points if it is ever required to be used. Hopefully she is built well enough that her ultimate and its following invigoration buff is enough to keep the team topped up by itself. If so, then this helps her remain SP positive and it avoids the headache of her skill's RNG. If you use Welt's ultimate when an enemy is between their 2 turns, if they do have 2 turns to use, their second turn doesn't come out and is just immediately cancelled. This can be very useful if their second attack has a lot of CC or just something that you want to avoid coming out. If you are in desperate need of an Acheron stack, since most of the time an Acheron team is the context that you'll be using him in, getting the freeze off from his skill does actually count as a debuff, so throw it out if you need a Hail Mary. Depending on the fight, it might be worth saving your ultimate for a bit to guarantee that the counters that you send out are going to the primary targets that you want to damage. Although the counters are blast attacks, so you will be hitting the primary target anyways, most likely, wasting the brunt of the damage on mobs that don't matter makes her DPS fall off a cliff, so try to avoid it if you can. If you are using DDD or 4-piece messenger on her in a -1 speed setup, be careful not to ult until after the carry's second turn in order to get the most out of the DDD action advance. In fact, using her ult during the carry's turn might cause your very fragile speed tuning to become misaligned. Avoiding this is especially important if you are, say, trying to squeeze 6 turns out of Boothill in one cycle. Yanqing is difficult to use since his largest damage window, which he gets from the buff from his ultimate, is just so limited as it only lasts for 1 turn. Typical energy funneling strategies can help, as ulting as much as possible is one way to try and make him usable, but the real best way to use him is just to make him a vessel for your best supports. Soup him up with your best premium options, and see if he's usable then. Also, obviously, he's pretty unusable even more so if you don't use him with shields. But that's the most obvious tip in the world, so whatever. When Seele gets her Resurgence kill reset, it's counted as if her turn has ended, meaning that buffs given to her while in the Resurgence state are essentially extended for an extra turn. However, this is a bit finicky, as you have to put the buff that you want to give her in the turn order before her kill goes through, as otherwise it will only come out after her Resurgence buff. Most of the time, nowadays, you will be using Jing Yuan with Sunday. So in that context, the goal is to maximize the amount of stacks that you can get out of him before Lightning Lord gets action advanced. So giving him extra energy will let him ult more often, which then increases his stacks per cycle. So with that in mind, Huohuo or Quid Pro Quo are great options to funnel energy into him. While it is annoying, it is possible to just reset for better RNG in order to get the most out of her talent bugs and her implants. That's not really a tip though, that's just kind of me saying skill issue, so I'll say that the best way to utilize her single target debuffs is to know how well your DPS can kill a target before they switch to a new target. Ulting a target that is about to die is just not worth it most of the time, even if it means maybe saving your ult or ulting another target that is not even being damaged right now. The key is to maximize the value out of your debuffs, as their single targetness is their weakest aspect. One important tip with Luocha is that the second part of his skill effect, where he auto-heals someone when they get low enough, does not count as an actual skill usage. It's just a, quote, equivalent to a skill usage. This means that something like Secherdos does not work on his auto skill. It will only proc when you manually skill with him, which is kinda lame. So if you are planning on building him with newer relic sets, just focus on speed to make him super SP positive, as currently there aren't any sets that let him directly buff, besides manually doing so with Sacerdos. Like with the tip with Seele, waiting to apply buffs until after he uses his skill helps extend the buff duration by an extra turn. Also, try to time his follow-ups or ultimate to not happen while his skill is down, as the extra damage from it being active affects his entire kit's damage. It's important to try and get her shock onto an enemy before you skill them, either by ulting them or by proccing her follow-up. This is easy for the start of the battle since her technique also applies the same shock onto all enemies, but when entering following waves, lining up your team's turns to proc her follow-up or her own ultimate can help maximize her damage output. Since using his ultimate gives you free skill uses, this essentially means that the more energy you give him, the less SP hungry he is, if only by a little bit. So Tingyun, Huohuo, or even a fast Sunday will do him very well, alongside the obligatory quid pro quo mention. A -1 speed approach with Sunday is very difficult to pull off and I wouldn't really recommend it, but with Sunday's light cone it does become kind of feasible. Not really. At the very least, building Sunday like Sparkle is a great way to use him for a DHIL, although Sunday's lower base speed makes this a bit substat intensive to really pull off. Fushuan's free CC resist refreshes every time her skill is refreshed, so using her skill early to reapply her field, even if it's not running out, may make sense in certain scenarios, like if you know that unavoidable CC is coming too fast for you to deal with. Also, she can use Trend about as well as Aventurine can, so go wild if you do want to use her with Acheron. Jingliu's 100% action advance when she goes into her state, coupled with her being played with action advancers like Bronya or Sunday, both have the unfortunate consequence that buffs on her tend to run out very quickly. Waiting for something like a Bronya ult until she is actually in her state might help maximize her damage. Also, it's nice to have buffs that rely on the buffer's turn, like all of Ruan Mei's abilities or Sunday's ultimate. One important thing with using Robin with Topaz is to take into account Numbi's action advancing before you ult with Robin. It can be very easy to forget about Numbi's action advancing when you have Robin's ult ready to use, but waiting to see whether your team's follow-ups will lead to an immediate follow-up from Numbi or not can help squeeze out an extra action on your team, which is the primary utility that Topaz brings for Feixiao or Mose. In many situations, it is better to use Argenti's half-powered ultimate rather than waiting for it to fully charge. Since his talent gives energy for hitting enemies, launching more ults means generating more energy, which then means launching more ults, if that makes sense. In Pure Fiction at least, try not to overkill enemies with a fully empowered ult, as if you do, then that's just wasted energy that you could have used elsewhere. In my opinion, Huohuo's energy recharge from her ultimate is more important than the attack buff that also comes with it. If your carry's ultimate is up, or if it's reachable within a very small amount of energy, most of the time it's a better idea to ult with your carry first before Huohuo ulting to maximize the amount of energy that you give to your carry. The primary exception to this is near the end of a fight, since if your carry is only going to have one more ultimate in a fight anyways, you might as well buff it with the attack percent to make it as powerful as possible. Ratio's Trace gives him more damage per enemy debuff, for a total of 5 debuffs for the maximum effect. So past making his follow-ups guaranteed, a high quantity of debuffs helps maximize his damage. Gallagher and Mose are good 4-star options for him since they each have 2 debuffs, and an E2 Mose specifically can work very well with him. Because her buffs are based on her own turn, waiting to use her ultimate until her turn actually starts helps the uptime to be as long as possible. In that same vein, if you can very comfortably clear a wave within a given cycle, waiting to ult on her until her next turn in the next wave can also help make the most out of her uptime. It's the same thought process. Or as a last fringe case, in the clip here, since I know I'll clear before Ruan Mei's turn, I can comfortably ult with her since I know the ultimate duration won't tick down since it won't get to her turn before the wave ends. As I found out through making a mistake on an earlier video, my bad by the way, Black Swan's ultimate debuff on the enemy makes them take more damage only on the enemy's turn. This means that for the intended effect, they take more damage from dots, but it also means that if you use an ultimate during their turn, or a counter like with Yunli or Clara, it will also benefit from this debuff, causing them to deal more damage. The easiest way to give Sparkle 3 actions in the first cycle, which is what you probably want to do with her, is with using both S5 DDD and the Eagle set. where then you need a total of 168 speed on her. That's still a lot of speed, and it's definitely very subset intensive, but it's somewhat doable if you grind enough. If you are willing to sacrifice a bit of damage, using the Firefly 2-piece from Simulated Universe for its 2-piece speed can make this threshold a bit more achievable. Von Whack also makes this a lot easier, but the problem with Von Whack is that it only works at the very start of battle. But at least for MOC, the second wave is usually where getting the most out of your actions is the most important. Like with Argenti, I think the most important thing with Acheron is not overkilling with her ultimate. Using one ultimate on the first wave of MOC versus 2, or 2 versus 3, or 3 versus 4, and so on, can make all the difference, as squeezing by with a ton of extra stacks into the second wave can make it go by a lot faster. The same can also be said with managing her stacks against bosses with multiple health bars. Overcapping her stacks can be worth it to a certain extent, just make sure it's not too much overcapping. Otherwise, ulting just to get to the next phase of the fight might be a worthy sacrifice to make. The advice that I gave with Silverwolf is doubly important with Aventurine, since his ultimate is his only real form of damage amping outside of his signature or eidolons. So ulting a more healthy enemy means that you will get more out of its extra damage, assuming you can actually utilize it before its duration ends. Also, as an extra tip, if you aren't trend stacking with him and you don't have his signature, Gepard's signature gives him an extra taunt value alongside a lot of defense. The extra taunt makes it so that his talent stacks faster since he gains extra stacks when he is the one getting hit. I wouldn't say to actually waste resources going for this Lycone in the shop though, it's just a strategy if you actually have this Lycone lying around. Woo! My main boy. Firstly, combining two previous tips, but after he enters his stance, buffs on him last an extra turn, again like Blade or Seele. This is important to consider with the Watchmaker buff, since Watchmaker is likely somewhere on his team. And also, him entering his stance allows him to be DDD'd, since his turn is technically over and he'll be action advanced like normal. Keep in mind that this only works on the turn that he actually enters the stance. If he starts his turn already in the stance, then none of what I've talked about applies. Getting Robin into her ult as fast and as consistently as possible, especially in the beginning of a fight, is the name of the game with her. Whether this means Jing Yuan ulting her at the start of a battle, or Bronya advancing her on Bronya's first turn, do whatever you need to get Robin in her state as fast as you can. With the Jing Yuan and Bronya examples, Robin ulting also means that she keeps those damage buffs for an extremely long duration, since her entire ultimate only counts as one turn. Also, using her against enemies that attack frequently, like Huohuo, essentially completely solves her energy needs. And it allows you to, for example, use her event weapon for its higher damage as opposed to relying on Bronya's signature for its extra energy. Assuming you aren't already using Robin's signature, that is. This might sound a bit complicated, but Jade's talent stacking does not count different parts of an attack as separate attacks that give separate charges. Like, for example, Boothill's enhanced basic followed by the last extra hit from him having trickshot stacks still counts as one attack, even though there's two quote-unquote parts to it, if that makes sense. So to avoid that, follow-ups are the name of the game here, since they are a separate action from a character's actual turn, and will therefore actually give Jade a lot of stacks. Like what I said with Jingliu, Firefly's action advance when using her ultimate means that it's a smart idea to wait for buffs like Watchmaker to be applied until she is actually in her ultimate state, dealing the majority of her damage. In that same vein, it's usually a good idea to wait to use her ultimate until you can ensure that her attacks will either break the enemy or attack an enemy that's already broken. Using Gallagher or Lingsha to whittle down an enemy's toughness gauge first using Firefly's fire implant is usually a good idea, especially if both of them are able to apply their break damage debuffs onto the enemy in that time. Don't waste too much action value setting this up, but any time Firefly spends in her state attacking unbroken enemies is wasted time, so just keep that in mind. The most important aspect to Yunli is ensuring that she gets off as many counters as possible, since besides it being her main form of damage, it's also her main source of energy through her trace. So allowing her to be attacked as much as you can gives her enough ultimates to clear content consistently. If you are within a cycle and you know an enhanced counter will kill an enemy, let them do all of their available attacks first, to ensure that her and her team are hit enough for their energy needs to be met. The only time that this isn't worth it is if waiting for this to happen will lead to buffs running out, such as Ting Yun's alt buff or Robin's Concerto, or other examples that you might be able to think of. Or obviously if doing this costs a cycle, but you don't need me telling you that, come on. If you want a more detailed example of the thought process of using Yunli, I'll put an old low budget clear in the description that I did for an old MOC rotation. If you can manage his high effect hit rate requirements, using pearls on Jiaoqiu greatly increases his damage amping potential, since his debuffs scale very well with the Light Cone's defense shredding. Keep in mind that Lingsha's talent, that makes Fu Yuan do an action if an ally gets hurt enough, acts similarly to Rappa's ultimate. It doesn't cause an action advance for Fu Yuan or anything, it just gives a free turn that happens immediately. Banking on an ally getting low during certain points of the fight can help maximize the toughness damage that Lingsha can put out. Like with Firefly, if you can manage to wait to Rappa ult until the enemies are actually breakable, if your team can help with that in any case, is usually a pretty good idea, especially since Rappa's ultimate gives her a free turn regardless of her actual action value, so there's no real threat of losing efficiency by waiting on her ultimate, like you're threatened with by waiting for Firefly's ultimate. One small thing is that Feixiao's talent can actually be essentially stacked up to 13 instead of the 12 that it tells you, since it can hold 2 charges after hitting 12, and if you get to the max then you'll just be at 7 after ulting instead of 6. Other than that, keep in mind that when using her with March's follow-ups only happen once per March's turn. So if you get multiple Feixiao actions in a row via Sunday or Bronya, March won't give her follow-up until she acts again, which is usually accomplished anyways once she reaches her max talent stacks and gains a turn immediately. The most important gearing decision with Sunday is to try and get him a 3-turn ultimate. This is of course easily done with his signature, no surprise there, but otherwise it's very difficult to maintain without outside intervention. He needs an S3 Bronya Light Cone alongside an ER rope and an ER planar effect, which at least for the S3 Bronya Light Cone part is just unrealistic for most people, especially since you're not going to be going to the shop to buy multiple Bronya Light Cones when you can just use those poles to actually just get Sunday's Light Cone. Luckily, getting hit by enemies is usually good enough for him to make up the difference, as it's a comparatively small amount of energy that stops him from having a smooth ult rotation otherwise. The primary extra benefit when it comes to Fugue's Exo Toughness is that it gives the benefits of breaking an enemy to characters once again when Exo Toughness is broken. So if that didn't make sense to you, essentially Himeko gets extra talent stacks, and the same goes for Rappa and Shui for their respective talents, and Acheron can get an extra debuff stack, so long as the Exo Toughness is broken on a separate turn from the initial break, if that's worth mentioning. But the most important interaction with this is with Boothill, as Exo Toughness allows him to significantly shorten his ramp up time with his trick shot. If you can manage to kill an enemy, break them, and break their Exo Toughness all in one attack, which is difficult to do, you can instantly get 3 trick shot stacks, completely eliminating his most glaring weakness as a unit. And that's everything! Again, I hope you learned something new about the game or the characters that you use, or maybe you just got a bit more insight into some of the typical decision making that goes on with certain teams or strategies in endgame modes. In any case, scroll down and make sure you're subscribed if you like my content, and stick around for all of my different coverage when 3.0 drops. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye!